But the truth is, their words wounded me more than the boils on my skin.
Well, welcome to the behind the scenes director's cut version of Bible Voices from the Past. In these episodes, we're going to take a few minutes and step behind the scenes, step back from the conversation that we recently had, and look at some things a little bit deeper. In this episode, I want to walk with you through a couple of the raw moments from our recent conversation with Job. So let's take a few minutes and break down the emotions behind his words and the theology behind some of the things that were said and the hope that's buried in the ashes. But there was a moment when Job said something I'll never forget, and it was at the very beginning of the episode, one of the very first things he said. Let's watch this clip real quick, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Thank you, Jonathan. I can tell you that I have learned that scars make the best storytellers. So yes, I'm glad to speak.
There, he says, scars make the best storytellers. There's one thing people cannot argue with, and that's our testimony. And when our testimony is not just about great things happening, but our testimony is about scars and about difficulties that we came through, they seem sometimes to be even more impacting. Whether it's physical scars on your body or emotional scars, relational scars, maybe even some spiritual scars, those scars come, and there's some incredible stories behind them. Think about testimony that you have, something God's brought you from. Those scars, nobody can argue with what happened to you and what God did for you. And those scars serve to remind us very often. We can look back and think, man, God brought me through. And they tell great stories, true stories, to help other people who are facing difficulties. So really, as Job said, true scars make the best storytellers. The second clip that I want us to look at, really, if you think about it, there's a kind of pain that doesn't scream, it doesn't yell, it doesn't grab for attention very outlandishly. There's a pain that just sits with you. Long after the dust settles, long after the funeral's over, long after the diagnosis, long after the situation kind of settles down. It's not the loss of what was, it's the silence that follows. The silence really from the one you thought would speak. And in the middle of the conversation with Job said something that cut through everything else. Watch this clip real quick before we comment.
But when everything fell apart, I was blameless, and the silence of heaven was deafening.
And the silence of heaven was deafening. Wow. I don't know if you've ever felt that listening today, going through difficulties, things happening all around us, and we wonder, where's God? Why isn't he talking? Why isn't he speaking? Things breaking loose, and you're just crying out to God. You want to hear something. You want some direction. You want God to speak something, and he's silent. Nobody picks up the phone to call you. Nobody reaches out to you. You even open God's word. I mean, God speaks through his word, right? And there are times it even seems like God's word's silent. Nothing's really speaking to me. Nothing's really... And Job's right. There are times when the silence can be deafening. And that wasn't anger talking. It wasn't even doubt. It was raw honesty from someone who cried out to God and got nothing back, at least at first. And I want you to pause here for a minute. Sit with that silence. Because sometimes faith isn't loud. Sometimes faith is just what's left when heaven goes quiet. When heaven goes silent. The faith that we sit with, the faith to hold on, the faith to endure and be faithful, even when God's voice doesn't seem to be speaking. This third clip, I want us to take a look at. If you've ever suffered, you know this truth, that people mean well, but they don't always help. They try to fix what they don't understand. You got people that hear you going through something, and they offer sometimes some of the dumbest stuff, they say. You got to step back and not get angry at them, because most of the time they love you. They're trying to help, but sometimes they say some of the dumbest things. Trying to comfort, trying to help. They offer cliches where really silence might have been more sacred. Job had some friends, 3 of them. They showed up in the middle of his pain, sat with him for a moment, was silent just for a moment, and then they started talking, and then they started talking a lot. Watch this clip real quick and look at what Job says in this interview about one of those moments.
But the truth is, their words wounded me more than the boils on my skin. They wanted easy answers to deep mysteries, but I learned firsthand that suffering doesn't always come with an explanation.
They wanted easy answers. They gave easy suggestions, right? They gave easy answers to Job. It's because you sinned, because this, because that. They had it all figured out, but they weren't the one going through the pain. They weren't the one that experienced the loss. And Job says, they wanted easy answers to deep mysteries, but I learned firsthand that suffering doesn't always come with an explanation. Isn't that true? There are some things that we suffer, and thank God as we come through it, things make a little bit of sense. We get a little bit of comfort that, okay, this was for a reason. But there are some things in life that we will never get an explanation for. There are some difficulties you're going to go through that you're never going to get a real good answer why it happened. There's a lot of whys that we're going to have to live with until eternity. There's a lot of whys that we're just going to have to express faith through. It's not always easy. In this fictional interview, Job says suffering doesn't always come with an explanation. That is true. There are people I have sat with in pastoral ministry, and they have poured out their heart, and they've expressed some of the deepest, darkest things that have gone on in their life, and I don't know what to say. And I start to talk, and I want to offer some quip, some little saying, some little cliche, maybe even a Bible verse, but it just doesn't seem very helpful. Sometimes silence is really what's needed. I don't have explanations for everything. There's enough stuff in my own life I can't explain. I can't tell you why. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll know when I get to heaven. Maybe one day I kind of have this picture in my mind that we get to heaven, everything, all explanations and reasons for things and all mysteries will be just downloaded in our brains and our heavenly brains, and we're going to understand everything. I don't know. Or maybe it's going to be quite the opposite. Maybe when we get there, we're just not going to care. I don't know. But I do know this, that we're not going to be able to explain everything. And that faith is somehow going to have to come through in some situations. And that's really what this episode, looking back on Job's interview, is really all about. Peeling back the noise to hear the quiet truth that Job lived through. Understand that not all pain is punishment. And also that not all storms come with a reason. There's one final clip I want us to look at, part of our conversation that I don't want to rush past. I don't want you to forget if you watch the episode. Because in just a few words, Job handed us something very rare. Not an answer, but an anchor. Watch this clip and we'll talk about it. What would you want people today who are maybe going through some similar things, what would you want them to know?
I want them to know that silence does not necessarily mean absence. I want them to know that unanswered prayers are not unheard ones, and that sometimes the greatest gift is not an explanation, but a deeper revelation.
Now that's not just theory. Those words are coming out of a story, a true story of a man who lost everything and still found God in the wreckage. Just because God is silent does not mean he's absent. Just because God isn't speaking does not mean he's abandoned us. And then unanswered prayers aren't unheard ones. That's comforting. I would love the answers, but I guess I just have to trust sometimes that even though my prayer hasn't been answered yet, God still heard it. God still hears me when I pray. And sometimes the greatest gift, as I said, the greatest gift isn't an explanation, but a deeper revelation. You know, sometimes the greatest gift isn't, Jonathan, here's why that happened. But like Job experienced when God spoke to him out of the whirlwind. Job, this isn't why it all happened. But now that it's happened, let me reveal a little more who I am. I want you to see me a little clearer. I want you to understand who I am a little better. I want your faith to be ignited when you see me in my majesty and my glory, when you see my power on display. Job didn't get an answer to why everything happened the way it happened, but he was left with a revelation of God that he would have never experienced or received if he hadn't gone through what he went through. So for some of you today, you're listening, you're trying to figure out why you're going through it. I'm not going to tell you to stop asking God. I'm not going to tell you just to lay that down and quit, because I think that's part of our wrestling. We want to know why. But I wonder if you'll pause where you're at, lay aside the why for just a moment, and say, God, what I need more is I want to see you better. I want to see you greater. Give me a deeper revelation of who you are. So today, if you're there right now, if you're in the fight, if you're in the questions, if you're where the tears just won't stop, then hold on to this fictional interview of Job and his message where he said, keep wrestling, because the storm isn't the end, and there is a God who still speaks even from the whirlwind. Now, Job never got all the answers, but he did get something better. He saw God in his splendor. And maybe that's the takeaway for us too. And maybe that's in these seasons of suffering when the why remains a mystery, the who still speaks. Well, thank you for joining me for this director's cut version of Bible Voices from the Past. If Job's story stirred something in you, a question, a prayer, a struggle, I invite you to sit with it. Maybe even comment on this and share it a little bit. Bring it into the light. Comment, subscribe, like, and share. Remember, you are not forgotten. You're not forsaken. You are seen. Until next time, keep listening to the voices from the past, because they just might be speaking to your present.